Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Everybody in the back, yeah? So I want to join the choir and thank our organizers for putting us together, and also thank you for the fruitful discussions we've been having. I'm very grateful because so many of you prepared the ground for my talk, so actually I might as well tell a few jokes and have coffee, and then we can, skip my talk. So I'm really, really grateful. And I'll be trying to build some bridges and references to your talks. My talk is entitled Performativity Techniques and Somatic Experience in the Buddhist Studies Classroom, but it's not going to be that much about the performative techniques and the somatic experience. This is because you can read about the theoretical framework of those techniques and their usefulness and their examples in so many books. And instead I will be focusing more on a very specific example of myself using these techniques in my classroom, and the challenges and limitations that these techniques have shown for me in my practice. So, and just to clarify, by performativity techniques, I mean any kind of immersion into ritual, Buddhist ritual. So this can include meditating with the students, or showing them examples of rituals, reenacting sutras, doing anything like that. And the somatic experience is more, my understanding definition is more passive. The students are exposed to certain sensory examples of Buddhist practices, Buddhist rituals, but they are not necessarily asked to engage, to repeat, and to do something. So that's how I define this for my talk. And a bit of background about my classes. Here at U of T, I teach classes on global Buddhism. And my specific example of challenges and limitations will be like a self-reflective consideration of a specific entangled challenge. On one hand, we will have a disengaged Buddhist instructor who doesn't want to be labeled as a Buddhist, and on the other hand, we will have an example of a student body who themselves blur the boundary between an academic seminar and religious instruction. I will pose a question. How can we facilitate a somatic and performative encounter with Buddhism against the background of the secular and multi-faith undergraduate classroom, if you teach at a public university, right, like the University of Toronto? So I think in an ideal situation, the secularity of classroom space and the diversity of classroom space can be maintained, and on the other, we can empower students to creatively engage with their experience of Buddhism and deep learning of Buddhism. Is this possible? I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I found my own way to try and approximate to the answer. So now, starting on those performativity techniques, like I said, I'm aware of the fact that I will be reinventing the wheel if I will be discussing them for a long time, because most of us are using them in our classrooms, and this room is full of experts on those techniques, and so they are nothing new, and there's a large body of scholarship exploring embodied learning and contemplative pedagogies. A bit of more background about myself also, because I will be exploring my positionality and my discomfort in my awkwardness in using them and engaging with them, is that I come from the Central European tradition of pedagogy, of the classical top-down knowledge transmission model. So before coming to Canada, I had my first MA from Poland. I'm Polish. So, and then I moved to Germany, where I had my MA in Tibetan Studies and did my PhD in Tibetan Studies. I was a faculty member for 6 years in Bonn, at Bonn University. So this is a very strong model that is with me. And this paper is actually a page from my journal of pedagogical self-discovery, and how these techniques inform my teaching, how I love them, but how I also wrestle with them. Just to begin, I would just like to briefly mention that in my understanding, performative and body techniques build a relationship between a student's experience of being in the body and the content of the class in order to initiate a more holistic learning, which has cognitive and many other advantages. This way, students can engage the body to explore their own understanding of religious experience and let this exploration inform their study of Buddhism and other religions. A scholar called Michelle Leoka calls this approach a post-Cartesian pedagogy. She critiques the classical style of education at U.S. universities as based on the Cartesian views of the primacy of reason over other aspects of human experience, 2, the separation of mind and body, and 3, the view that the body by itself lacks intelligence. By the way, I would love to see a paper. It would be very promising for somebody to explore this type of post-Cartesian pedagogy approach with the Buddhist notions of the non-duality of the mind and body, and also especially Tantric Buddhist notion that even the ordinary body can be a vehicle of wisdom and knowledge. That would be interesting, but I won't go there. Instead, I want to show you a book that I've discovered by Victoria Rue, Acting Religious Theater as a Pedagogy in Religious Studies. The author is a theater director, playwright, feminist theologian, religious studies pedagogy scholar. She writes as a Catholic, and this book is a dialogue between Christian theology and theater. Drawing from her background in theater and performance studies, Rue argues that theater explores the body as a signpost for the holy. And it proposes that theater simultaneously makes our reality and another reality present to us. Theater is an enfleshment, this is a quote from Victoria Rue, an incarnation, a stumbling attempt to approach and understand our world and beyond our world. And so, for me, this book is a really nice repository of techniques, including the ones that I know Francis uses, like reenacting sutras, so almost like writing it's called screenplays, yeah? Screenplays from classical Buddhist texts and reenacting them during class, role play. And I also appreciate Victoria Rue's theoretical discussions on the embodied surge for the numinous. So if you're looking for an inspiration, I refer you to this book. And Rue also admits, I was surprised, she admits that only in the final chapter or somewhere in the afterword, that it takes courage to teach with these performative techniques. What I argue is that it's not so much courage or the character or the personality of the instructor. I would argue that it's a lot about the positionality of the instructor. And that has there are many different things that play to that, because when we ask our students to do something for our course, we expect something from them. They are supposed to act in our name and in the name of the discipline and use those techniques. And they do this under our guidance. So because these techniques deeply engage the student in the experience of religiosity, I personally always felt there may be ethical questions to be considered here. And please do not take it as a critique of your own classroom practices. I admire them and I'm happy that you use them. It's just, I'm talking about my own considerations based on my positionality, and especially the one aspect of it as a Buddhist, which I will explain soon. And this is also, for sure, this is connected to the very specific European sensitivities about the secular, necessarily secular nature of university education. To the point that this secularity is sacred. I think Vanessa, who's coming from Quebec, can also relate to that, right? So to us in Central Europe, in many places, secularity is the sacred. And we must not forget that even Buddhist studies, they have completely different histories on the old continent than they do here. So, as far as I know, Buddhist studies in America evolved from as a branch of theology and are housed in divinity schools, whereas in Europe, of course, it's historical linguistics and departments like that. So it's a completely different context. But anyway, I love the techniques, the performative techniques, theater techniques, somatic techniques. I'm intrigued by them, and I use I try to use many of them as much as I can. What I do is I use the techniques that do engage the body but leave the degree of the response to the learner. So, for instance, I always have a lot of visuals that are discussed in the class, but my favorite techniques involve listening to sound recordings to induce these deeper levels of learning. I will give you an example from a course I'm teaching also this semester. It's a course on global Buddhism that I teach in the Scarborough campus, which is a little further away from here, from this campus. And the department expects me to cover, well, early history of Buddhism, early developments, and the early global moments. So, everything outside of India, Gandhara, and then going into Central Asia and China, stuff like that, but also doctrinal history. And so, for instance, when I show my students the practice of going for refuge as one of the most universal practices among the Buddhists, and I show them the Sanskrit formula, and then I play this recording. For them to help them memorize and contextualize as well.
계산이 유지되는 구멍 도역이 도가로 속았네. 렉자를 하이 깨도 점점 뇌한단체 쇠양 유지 소수.
I will just fast forward because it's beautiful, but it's very long. So I use it as a very simple technique to help students memorize the Sanskrit, maybe not the Sanskrit formula, but what the three jewels are, and to help them connect the fact that it's such a ubiquitous Buddhist practice. I'm also completely aware of the fact that I'm completely underutilizing this wonderful recording, and that there's so much going on in this recording that I could use in a graduate course or in another conversation. This is, of course, global Buddhism and the wonderful diasporic setup, and the Tibetans who have this formula, of course, translated into their own language, and they use it normally in Tibetan. They translate it back into what they conceive to be a holy language in offering to the Dalai Lama. There's so much in it, right? But so I'm aware of the fact that I'm underutilizing it, but still, I think it's a nice example. But let me just go back to the dilemmas I was actually going to talk about. Let me talk about maybe the first instance of this course, Global Buddhism in Historical and Contemporary Societies. The first time I taught it, I had the enrollment of 23 people. At the Scarborough campus, we mostly have perhaps 80% of my class would be people from mainland China, 50% Canadians of South Asian descent, and then maybe some other people. So it's, people also predominantly with Buddhist roots or with some Buddhist history or connection. And so I always also ask them about their expectations. No matter who is there, I always ask my students, why are you here? What are you expecting to learn in this course? Actually, Chimi Lama, who was here yesterday, she was in this course. She didn't come today. Anyway, and I was very surprised because many people told me that they are interested in exploring Buddhism as a personal spiritual path. But this was still okay. And then somebody stood up. One of this group stood up, and she asked me, "Are you Buddhist?" And I felt extremely put on the spot. But of course, I was very reluctant. But I had to reveal what I always thought to be my off-campus personality, my off-campus identity, and tell the class that indeed I was. I couldn't weasel out of it. And this is precisely a moment that William Parsons, a scholar of religious studies pedagogy, has termed being thrust, if someone unwillingly, into the role of an insider. More on this unwillingness. You may be surprised, especially after hearing John speak, Buddhist in the classroom. I'm a different type of Buddhist in the classroom. And actually Buddhists as higher ed educators, this topic has been explored, for instance, by this book by Sid Brown. I think Anne has written a review of this book. Yes? Yes. So, it's a widely known scholarship, and especially the contemplative turn in pedagogy and some strands of socially engaged pedagogies have been spearheaded by Buddhists. I would argue that the positionality of these scholar practitioners as instructors is situated in the larger discourse within and about North American Buddhism, and it is informed by their convictions of Buddhism as a path of social engagement. For these scholar practitioners, Buddhism is and should be primarily a tool for promoting peace, social justice, environmental issues. As such, it is a perfect vehicle for educating others. Now, I'm a very different specimen from John and other people, so actually, Anne has brought up this article by Amos Lely called The Disengaged Buddhist. Yes, so I'm the typical example of a disengaged Buddhist. No public agenda, private, disengaged self. And I think that bringing this positionality to the table may also kind of be interesting for us in this workshop. Now, whether the Buddhist in the classroom is of the first or the second type, obviously depends very much on the tradition, lineage, teacher, or Dharma network they are connected with, whether this Dharma network or teacher is more sensitive to reform and adaptive to social issues of the day, or whether it is more orthodox, or they are more orthodox and traditionalist, and thus perhaps more private. This positionality is also influenced by our research interests. So for instance, what I do in my research, I work on reiterations of Orthodox Buddhism in local communities. And as you know, this is becoming transnationalized and globalized, but it's still my main interest. And also there's the basic question. In our classroom, do we teach Buddhism or do we teach about Buddhism? And to me, it was very clear from the beginning of when I started teaching at university, 2011, when I started at Bonn, I am teaching about Buddhism. But this creates problems. Being publicly acknowledged as a Buddhist, the professor as insider faces her own challenge. And when we are forced to surrender that which we do not wish to reveal about ourselves, as Victoria Rue, to paraphrase Victoria Rue. So this creates a position of vulnerability, which I think can be a very interesting training field for us. And it has prompted me to rethink my teaching philosophy. I will tell you about this in a moment. But practical solution, in the meantime, one may think, okay, but for a disengaged Buddhist, isn't it enough to decide to teach about Buddhism, and if somebody outs us, if somebody calls us out as Buddhist, to explain what is the difference between studying Buddhism in an academic environment with critical methods and in a faith community? Isn't it enough? No, it's not, because I've tried and I've spent, in this particular instance of this course, I spent so much time even soliciting the help of my students who did understand, to help me out and explain to everyone what the difference is. Still, the label of the Buddhist professor sticks, and you are there with it. And I was actually, and it may extend to other areas of teaching. So during office hours, I discovered that a very, very gifted student of mine, who I was wondering about, why isn't he making any progress in this class, which is a very basic introductory class. It is about, the Buddha's life story and things like that, basics, what's keeping him from moving on. And I felt like he had a kind of a psychological barrier, and I started feeling where he's at, and I discovered that he was actually afraid of being converted to Buddhism in a way, especially through all these techniques where I'm playing, showing all these high masters and the rituals and everything. So this is where I discovered that this was actually a very interesting case study of this entangled vulnerability of the student and of the instructor. It inspired me to think about what Ed Brandmeier writes, and he terms it a pedagogy of vulnerability. he says, a pedagogy of vulnerability challenges teachers to render their frames of knowing, feeling, and doing vulnerable. The concept is simple. Open yourself, contextualize that self in societal constructs and systems, co-learn, admit that you don't know, and be human. And then further down, I like this quote. Simply understood, a pedagogy of vulnerability is about taking risks of self-disclosure, precisely that, risks of change, risks of not knowing, etc. I can give you the reference if you like after I'm finished speaking. So I've been inspired by this concept, and I've been working with it and asking myself, how can this concept and this idea inform my teaching? And I've actually rewritten my teaching philosophy ever since. I've discovered, for instance, that my teaching style is much more collaborative than I ever thought. I love being on par, in the same position with my students and co-create knowledge during class. Somehow, I never knew that about myself. So it's this kind of perplexity of the insider positionality can open a collaborative learning space and lead hopefully to a transformative situation in which the student can learn better, and we can rethink our role as a university instructor. So why am I here? But of course, this is a process of longer self-inquiry, so I'm just beginning. And in the meantime, I had to acknowledge these entangled vulnerabilities and figure out how to proceed with this discomfort for the benefit of everyone involved. How can I maintain the secular ethos of the public university, respect the multi-faith belonging in our classroom, respect the autonomy of human beings not to engage in religion and spirituality at all? My take on it is perhaps may sound counterintuitive, and I call it the aesthetics of ritual in context. So I believe, for myself, I solve it through a gradual and deliberate exposure to real-life ritual practices from real-life Buddhist communities. How do I expose the students to that? For instance, through audio visuals like this, or through field trips, ethnographic assignments, or classroom visits by a local Buddhist authority. What I do two things in that. First of all, I create a cognitive distance between Buddhism and the students so that they feel kind of more comfortable, and that if they want, they can approximate. Yeah, they can do that. They can approximate if they want, but they can also stay on the outside. On the other hand, I remove myself from the equation, and I'm just a pointing finger. And for a higher level course in the future, I would like to use the research by ethnomusicologists for the same purpose. So what I would like to share with you is work by a guy called Jim Sykes, who's been inspiring me very much. He's worked on the relationship between Theravada Buddhism and folk music rituals. Fantastic work. He has 2 articles that he also illustrates with video and sound recordings. So I can envision myself playing this for my students, and they can participate, because Sykes makes a lot of arguments through drumming, through the analysis of drumming patterns. So the students, if they want, they can... I'll just play this very quickly. So, they have, I will save it for the end. Anyway, so they can engage also in the drumming if they want, but they don't have to. They will have read the article, the critical article, and once we have gone past the ethnomusicologist jargon, which can be quite heavy. But anyway, this work is great. I recommend it. And as a very last point, I would like to say that also the aesthetics of ritual for me is a great bridge of interreligious dialogue, which inevitably happens in our classroom. And especially, I have to say, for me, it happens very often in my classroom, because these kind of techniques, they prompt people to to deepen their knowledge and to engage with the material about Buddhism. But also, it happened to me several times that students, especially with a Muslim background or Christian background, they started comparing, even in their term papers, comparing their own tradition with Buddhism. So they somehow feel compelled to relate the sensory impressions and feelings, this whole affectual complex activated by an exposure to somatic and performative techniques, to the experience of their own faith. So I think this is a very fruitful direction, and I would like to conclude with that. And this is just this is my response to the meditation or mindfulness Barbie. This is a page from WikiHow. It's called How to Be a Good Buddhist Girl, in case you can't see it. I love it. And the last point is, I take it to heart. It says, be enthusiastic at school or work and try your best. Always. Never be lazy. So,